Lecture 4, Supply and Demand. Supply and demand is the fundamental model of economics. It is the flow of the invisible hand. It helps us figure out prices of goods and how many goods are purchased and sold. In addition, it's going to help us understand who gets to consume the goods that are produced and who gets to produce the goods. First off, we have to think about where does the model of supply and demand come from, and really about the market structures. So this is all the different types of market structures, from most competitive, meaning it has the most number of market participants, buyers and sellers, to the least competitive, where basically all consumers buy from one entity. So the supply and demand model exists in a world of perfect competition. So this is a situation where all the sellers, and there's lots and lots of them, all produce identical products. Okay, so something like, we can imagine corn or something like that, or wheat, where basically all sellers produce an identical product. There's not really a real life example of a perfectly competitive market, but thinking about something in agriculture is the closest we can get. Let's have a look at each of the structures in a little bit more detail. So here's our 4 market structures. Now, when it comes to the number of firms, the type of market structures that have many firms are monopolistic competition and perfect competition. So perfect competition, again, all sellers are selling the same product, identical. You cannot distinguish between them, right? And yes, milk is definitely one of those. Then we have differentiated products in monopolistic competition, which means products are pretty much serve a similar utility, except there's many different options in order to purchase. When we're thinking about an oligopoly, when we have very few firms, right, anything 2 to 10 or 2 to 15, we think of the oligopoly structure. And those are structures where you have a few competitors competing in an interdependent way in order to provide consumers with goods. The car industry is a really good example of an oligopoly. Finally, a monopoly is when one firm produces all of the output in one given good. A nice example of this in the real world is like cable TV providers in certain geographical regions. So for example, in my region, Spectrum is the only cable TV provider that you can find, right? And so they become the sole provider in terms of electricity, right? Like something like LADWP or Southern California Edison, they are the only possible producers of that good in that specific location. So if you want to buy electricity in the city of Santa Monica, you will be buying it from Southern California Edison. Now, those are special types of monopolies. Those are monopolies that are generated or created by the government. Again, now let's look at each one with a few more details. So perfect competition or pure competition is rare in the real world, but the model is important because it helps us analyze industries with characteristics similar to pure competition. So examples of this model are the stock market and agricultural industries. Now you may wonder why the stock market is fitting into perfect competition, because you may, assume that they're not selling absolutely identical products. Well, in fact they are, because everything sold on the stock market is basically a share of a company. Yes, different companies, but in fact they are still shares in that company. And the way that the market is organized in terms of buyers and sellers, it actually mimics a perfectly competitive market. So again, in a perfectly competitive market, there's many sellers, right? No one seller's decision impacts the market price. Everyone sells standardized or homogeneous products, so identical. And firms are price takers, which means whatever the market price is set, the firm will take it, and they will have absolutely no influence on price. Also, to enter or exit a perfectly competitive market, you are completely free. Now, this chapter, when we cover supply and demand, the type of model that this supply and demand exists in is in this perfectly competitive model. The second type of structure is monopolistic competition. This is a little less competitive than the perfect competition. So monopolistic competition refers to a market situation with a relatively large number of sellers offering similar products that are not identical. So good examples of these are fast food restaurants, clothing stores. You can see an array of examples here in this little chart. So you have all the different gas station companies, McDonald's, Walmart, etc. Again, you have a lot of firms. Each has a small percentage of the total market because we all still have certain preferences. For example, gasoline, I tend to stick with Chevron for no real purpose other than I get a discount due to my grocery store, but it creates a kind of consistent customer return. So if it was really inconvenient for me to find a Chevron, would I go to Shell? Why, yes, I would. Now, the products are differentiated. So the variety of the products makes this model different from pure competition. So the products are differentiated by style, brand name, location, advertising, packaging, pricing strategies, etc. Once again, easy to enter or exit this market. Oligopoly. So an oligopoly is when a few large firms produce either differentiated or homogeneous products. So examples are the automobile and the gasoline industries. There's a few large firms. Each must consider the reaction of its rivals in response to its decisions about prices, outputs, and advertising. And entry becomes very hard into this type of structure. Here we see a series of large conglomerates and basically their subsidiary companies. So what you'll notice here is Nestle owns a lot of smaller companies, including things that you wouldn't expect, like L'Oreal. They also own Hugo Boss and Lacoste and Diesel and so on. And you can see that across these different types of producers. Monopoly. So monopoly exists when a single firm, one firm, is the sole producer of a product for which there is no close substitute. So examples are public utilities and professional sports leagues, etc. So the monopolies are selling a completely unique product. There is no close substitute for this firm's product. The firm is a price maker, which means they have substantial control over the price. Now, one thing I want you guys to keep in mind is, does that mean a monopoly can decide what use to sell a product at any price that they choose? The answer is no, right? Remember, the value of the good to the consumer is equally an important component of the price. All right, so the assumptions of the supply and demand model. First, the model of demand and supply operates within the confines of the perfectly competitive model. There's two reasons we use this model. Basically, it's just easier to learn, and it makes it a lot easier to learn the more realistic but complicated analysis of the imperfectly competitive models. And despite the lack of realism, the perfectly competitive model can teach us a lot about how the real world works. Now, for our examples, we're not going to be sticking to just the wheat and milk as our examples. We'll be modeling all types of products. Back to utility. Remember, utility is satisfaction and happiness a consumer gets from the consumption of a good or service. Marginal utility is the happiness derived from each additional unit of consumption. So, for example, if you have already had 2 slices of pizza, how much utility will you derive from the third slice? Would it be more or less than the utility you derived from the second slice? Now, according to the law of diminishing marginal utility, you actually will yield less utility when you consume the third slice versus the second. Let's look at an example here from Paul Krugman's masterclass. So he says, how much would you pay for a cell phone? First, it depends on your current cell phone status. Do you have a phone currently, or are you basically starting from scratch? Second, If you don't presently have a phone, you'd like to pay upwards of $1,000 for a phone with a fast internet connectivity, a great camera, and a long battery life. Now let's say you bought that phone. How much would you pay to acquire a second phone to go along with it? Well, probably far less than you would have paid for the first one, and you'd pay less to acquire a third phone. The fact is that you'd pay less for each successive phone helps illustrate the law of diminishing marginal utility. In a few slides, you'll have a little video about the law of diminishing marginal utility. But first, let's put some quantification to it. So, how many slices will you eat? So here is slices of pizza that you just purchased. This is the total utility you derived from a consistent consumption of one slice after the other. And notice if you get 0 slices of pizza, then you actually have 0 utility as a result. Now, just for simplification, we're going to make this assumption. We're going to say 1 unit of utility is equal to $1. And in deciding how many slices to eat, we're going to actually have to calculate our marginal utility. So let's start with the marginal utility of the first slice of pizza. So we start from a point of 0. We haven't had any pizza, and the first pizza is consumed. Well, how much is our utility? Total utility. Well, we get $2.50 of utility, which means the marginal utility is also $2.50. What about from the first slice to the second slice? So in terms of total utility, once you consume 2 slices, you get 4 units or $4 worth of total utility. But what is the additional utility gained? Well, in this case, the additional utility gained is going to be $4 minus $2.50 or $1.50. And you can see as we move on from consuming the additional units of pizza, we start to see our marginal utility start to fall of the additional unit, right? And you can see here after the 4th slice, when we consume the 5th, our marginal utility is actually fallen and has become negative. Okay, so that means you're actually getting disutility as a result of consuming the 5th slice of pizza. Okay, so let's think about this. If the price was $2, how many pizzas would you consume? Well, let's look at our utility. So if the price was $2, well, you'd definitely want to purchase at least 1 slice of pizza because the marginal utility is $2.50. Would you consume 2 slices of pizza? The answer is no, because the marginal utility you would earn is actually less than the price. What if the price was $1? How many pizzas would you consume then? Well, you're consuming as long as the marginal utility exceeds the price, and in this case, that would mean you would consume 3 slices of pizza. What if it was free? How many slices would you consume? You may think initially an infinite amount, but if we look at this chart, we notice that if the price was 0, there's no reason we would consume more than 4 slices because the 5th slice actually starts to make us sick and creates disutility. So at $2, we'd buy 1 slice. At $1, we'd buy 3 slices. And at $0, we'd actually buy 4 slices. So this illustrates the law of diminishing marginal utility.
To explain the law of diminishing marginal utility, we need to obviously understand what utility and marginal utility are. Simply put, utility is a term economists like to use to describe the satisfaction you feel after consuming a product or service, whereas marginal utility represents the increase in utility you experience after consuming 1 more unit of that product or service. The law of diminishing marginal utility, also called Gossen's first law as a tribute to Hermann Heinrich Gossen, simply states that as you consume more, the marginal utility usually goes down. In other words, a glass of orange juice provides a lot of satisfaction when you're thirsty. You can drink another one, but it won't provide as much satisfaction as the first. A third glass might give you additional satisfaction, but not much, whereas as of a certain point, we're in negative utility territory because let's just say you probably won't feel too well after drinking the 10th glass. Of course, there are exceptions, anything from deriving more pleasure from binge watching several episodes of a show rather than just one, to enjoying your stamp collection more as you continue adding to it, but all in all, the law of diminishing marginal utility provides a decent glimpse into how humans consume.
You may be asking, what does utility have to do with demand? Why did we have to go over the law of diminishing marginal utility? Well, you'll see that clearly illustrated once we discuss the law of demand. So first, we want to define the word quantity demanded. And quantity demanded is how much consumers are willing and able to buy, in terms of number of goods, at a particular price during a particular period of time. Now, you may be interested as to why this period of time is relevant. Well, I want you guys to think about, let's say, a time of day in terms of, say, buying coffee. When are you likely to pay more for coffee? And usually it's going to be either early in the morning or before you have some kind of presentation or project or something that you need to attend to where you need to pay more attention or be alert. So throughout the day, your quantity demanded, again, or the number of units you're willing to purchase can change. So what does the law of demand say? Well, it says that the relationship between price and quantity demanded is a negative or inverse one, meaning when prices increase, the number of units that we want to purchase actually falls. Now, let's think back to our marginal utility example, or our pizza example. Remember, initially when the price of pizza was $2, right, we were only willing to buy one slice of pizza. So to induce us to buy more slices of pizza, what the seller can do is drop the price. And when the price fell to $1, we were able to buy 3 slices of pizza. Now, would it make any sense for the seller to sell you a pizza for $0? Probably not, unless it was some kind of promotion, which we'll discuss later. So here's a demand schedule. A demand schedule tells us basically all of the different combinations of prices and quantity demanded for a certain consumer for a certain good. In this case, we're looking at Helen's demand for lattes. And we'll see that when Starbucks charges $0, Helen demands 16 lattes. Hopefully that's per week and not per day. But as the price starts to increase, notice that her quantity demanded for lattes is decreasing. So if we were to graph the preferences for Helen, right, when lattes are $6, she buys 5. Lattes are $5, she buys 6. And when the price of lattes becomes 0, she buys 16 units. So notice we have a downward sloping demand curve. Now this is for one individual. Well, what if we have lots of market participants? So here you'll see that we're looking at Helen's demand for lattes at different prices, and then also Ken, well, he has different preferences. And notice at 0, he only wants to get 8 lattes, unlike Helen who wants 16. Now the market demand is created by adding up all of the different consumers in the marketplace and their preferences in terms of price and quantity demanded. Notice that the market quantity demand acts just the same as an individual's quantity demand, such that when prices are increasing, the quantity demanded is decreasing. One very important distinction that we need to make is a change in demand versus a change in quantity demanded. A change in quantity demanded is simply movement along a given demand curve, whereas a change in demand will actually be a shifting in and out of that demand curve. So when you're shifting the demand curve, what that really means is that for any given price, consumers want to buy more goods. So more goods are demanded at every single price. This shows us a rightward or an increase in demand. What might cause the demand curve to shift? Well, we have 5 shifters. First, taste and preferences. Second, income. Third, prices of related goods. Fourth, the number of buyers. And fifth, expectations about future price. We're going to look at each of these in detail. Demand shifters, tastes and preferences. So anything that causes a shift in tastes towards a good will increase demand for that good and shift the demand curve to the right. So think of this as something like simple, like if, let's say, research finds that coffee makes you taller, all of a sudden we'd see an increase in the demand for coffee just because people think it will make them taller. So anything that change preferences towards the desire to consume a certain good will cause the demand to go up. Now, could demand also decrease as a result of changes in taste and preferences? Of course it can. Let's see how consumer preferences changed due to COVID-19. This is an article from Yahoo Finance. So it says, according to Yelp, interest in home fitness equipment surged 344%. Attendance in outdoor parks spiked 53%. Purchasing water soared 166%. Firearms purchasing sold 360%. This was just in the week that ended March 18th. Actual purchases of water skyrocketed 99% for the 1 week period ending March 14th compared to the week prior. Some of the top household purchases for that time were oat milk, toilet paper, dried beans, rice. They all saw increases that were exponential, basically. You can see toilet paper rose by 212%, which obviously didn't even compare to oat milk, which soared 476%. Now, demand shifted in these cases, and later on we'll go into detail into discussing how that might have impacted the price of these goods. So a shift in demand would look something like this. You'd have your price on your y-axis, quantity on your x-axis. You have your downward sloping demand curve, D1, and you have your new demand curve that shifted outward or increased at D2. The second thing that shifts demand is income. So first, we have to distinguish between two types of good. First, normal goods, which are positively related to your income, and they basically state when your income increases, you purchase more quantity at every given price, causing a outward shift in demand. So these are goods that you purchase more of as your income goes up. The next video will show you guys a series of examples.
What is a normal good? A normal good describes all goods and services for which demand increases when income increases. Imagine you're a poor student, but when you graduate, you get a high-paying job. With that new high-paying job, your income goes up, and you're probably going to demand more automobiles, more housing, more fine dining. These are normal goods. Demand for them goes up when income goes up, and demand for them goes down when income goes down. Now let's graph what happens to the demand for fine dining, a normal good, during two situations, during a boom and during a recession. Here's our demand for these restaurants. What is going to happen to this demand when the economy goes into a boom, when people's incomes go up? In a boom, the demand for these restaurants is going to increase because it's a normal good, so we get an increase in demand. What about in a recession? Of course, in a recession, we get the opposite. In a recession, when incomes are going down, the demand for these restaurants is also going down. So we see how demand for a good or service is affected by your income. But income isn't the only thing that can affect demand. To learn about the nuances of how the price of a good or service affects demand, click here. Or to test your knowledge on normal goods, click here. Still here? Check out Marginal Revolution University's other popular videos.
Right. The second type of good is an inferior good, and this is negatively related to income. So when your income increases, you purchase less of this type of good. So an increase in income shifts the demand curve for inferior goods to the left. What are some examples of inferior goods? Well, we'll have a look at this video next.
What is an inferior good? An inferior good is a good or service where your demand goes down when your income goes up, and vice versa. For example, when you're a student and not making much money, you might eat at McDonald's a lot because it's cheap. But when you graduate and your income increases later, you then eat at McDonald's less often, and instead go to better, more expensive restaurants. Let's look closer at a specific example. We're going to think about the demand for ramen, and we're going to think about it in two different situations, namely during a boom and during a recession. Here's our demand for ramen. What's going to happen to this demand when the economy goes into a boom, when people's incomes go up? So we'll draw this new demand curve. What's the new demand curve going to look like? Well, in a boom, the demand for ramen is going to decrease because ramen is an inferior good, so we get a decrease in demand. What about in a recession? Of course, in a recession, we get the opposite. In a recession, when incomes are going down, the demand for ramen is going up. Now, inferior goods are not the only types of goods. To learn more about those other types of goods, click here. Or to test your knowledge on inferior goods, click here. Still here? Check out Marginal Revolution University's other popular videos.
Demand shifters, prices of related goods. So the first classification of goods we're going to look at is substitute goods. Substitute goods are goods you use instead of each other. For example, pizza and hamburgers. Technically, an increase in the price of pizza will increase the demand for hamburgers, shifting the demand curve for hamburgers to the right. So what does that mean? Well, pizza, the first good that experienced a price increase due to some reason that we do not effectively at this point know. And what happened is now hamburgers are relatively cheaper. Since they are cheaper, consumers will prefer to consume more hamburgers and therefore shifting away some of the demand from pizza. Other examples can be Coke and Pepsi, laptop and desktop computers, gas cars, and electric cars. Complements. Complements are goods that you use together. They are consumed as one. Examples, computer and software, peanut butter and jelly, bagels and cream cheese, etc. So in the case of computers and software, if the price of computers go up, people buy fewer computers, and therefore they buy less software. So the change in the price of computers causes a decrease in the demand for software, shifting the demand curve for software to the left. Again, similar, we can do the same thing with peanut butter and jelly. If the price, say, of jelly goes up, you may consume less. Your demand for peanut butter may decrease since you cannot consume them together. The last shifter of demand is expectations. And this is expectations about the future. So our expectations will affect the way we buy. So for example, if consumers expect their income to rise, their demand for meals at expensive restaurants may increase now. If, however, the economy sours and people worry about their future job security, demand for new cars may fall now. Same time, demand for expensive restaurants may fall now. The last shifter of demand is the number of buyers. This is the most direct and easy. If a certain good all of a sudden experiences an increase in the number of buyers, say more people in the economy, more people with access to purchasing goods, we can clearly see that there would be a positive shift in demand. An important qualifier. A change in the price of a good will not result in a change in the demand for that good. So remember, price cannot shift the demand curve. So this example will illustrate a change in demand versus a change in quantity demanded. Let's use this question. Suppose that a local pizza place likes to run a late night special. The owners have contacted you for some advice. One of the owners tells you, we want to increase the demand for our pizza, and he proposes two marketing ideas to accomplish this goal. So what we're trying to achieve is an increase in the demand for pizza, okay? So the first option is to reduce the price of the pizza, and the second is to reduce price of a complementary good. For example, offer two half-price bottles or cans of soda with every large pizza ordered. Let's start by drawing our axes. So we have our x and y axes. Of course, we label the x-axis quantity demanded, and our y-axis is price. So let's start by drawing our demand curve. And here's our demand curve for pizza. Okay, so let's illustrate what happens if we change the price. Let's start off with a price, say this is our initial price of the large pizza. I don't know, let's say it's $12. And the quantity demanded is 10 units. Now, what happens if we get a reduction in the price? So reduction in the price, say to $10 per large pizza. Well, what happens? Well, we have an increase, say, in quantity demanded to 12 units. So what we're seeing here is all we've done is we've moved, right, along our given demand curve. So this, in fact, illustrates a change in quantity demanded, not a change in demand. Let's see what happens if we change the demand for this pizza. So what we established is, first of all, that reducing the price of the pizza does not alter the demand for pizza. Now let's see what happens when we change the price of a complementary good. Now recall that a complementary good is something that is used in conjunction with pizza. So for example, in this case, you have pizza and together you consume it with some kind of soft drink that you can purchase at the pizza place. So they're consumed together. So let's see what happens. If you reduce the price of a complementary good or a good that is used in conjunction with pizza, what would happen, as we know from our previous lecture, is that there will be a change or an increase in the demand for pizza. So the change in demand, right, we'll see illustrated by a new demand curve. We'll call it D2. And now, even at that $12 price, right, we now have more quantity demanded at the price. So we didn't even have to change the price of the pizza. All we did was actually just reduce the cost of the drinks, and that helped increase the demand for pizza. So this case illustrates a change in demand, which basically, even at the given price of $12, right, we have a higher quantity demanded of pizza without effectively changing the price. So again, a product's own price cannot shift the demand curve as we saw this shift occur here. So if we were going to be advising this pizza parlor shop owner, which policy would we suggest in order to increase the demand for his pizza? Why, in fact, it would be to reduce the price of the complementary good, which is again the bottle or can of soda reduced price, maybe even giving one for free in certain cases. Pizza places offer free, cheese sticks and stuff like that. So hopefully that illustrates the concept between change in demand versus change in quantity demanded. Okay, so here's a little quiz. So incomes increase. In a graph in a market for bus rides, what would we expect? Bus rides here we assume are an inferior good. Remember, as your income increases, your demand for inferior goods will decline. This video will show you guys exactly occurs. Next quiz. If muffins and bagels are substitutes, a higher price for bagels would result in what? So if muffins and bagels are substitutes, and you increase the price of bagels, that would mean that some consumers would shift away from consuming bagels and increase the demand for muffins. Next quiz. Suppose scientists provide evidence that chocolate pudding increases the bad cholesterol levels of those who eat it. What would we expect? This is a change in tastes and preferences. So bad cholesterol increasing due to consumption of pudding will decrease the demand for the pudding. This video will show you the process. Finally, the Ford Motor Company announces that next month it will offer a $3,000 rebate. As a result, what happens to today's demand curve for Mustangs? Well, what will happen today is that today, since we know that in a month it's going to be $3,000 cheaper, we'll hold off our consumption if we possibly can. Therefore, we decrease today's demand and shift the demand curve to the left. The video will illustrate. Okay, some algebra and the demand curve. So the demand curve is a downward sloping line, and the price is of course our y-axis and our quantity is our x-axis. So recall that an equation for a line is y equals mx plus b, and here's our demand function. So let's graph it out. So here we go. So question here is what is the quantity demanded if price is 4? So what would that mean? We'd plug in 4 into this value for, right? So we'd plug in 4 in here and solve for Q. So in this case, when we solve for Q, we find that Q equals 8. So if the price is $4, the quantity demanded is 8 units. What happens if the price is $2? Once again, we plug in our $2 price into the demand function, so into P, and we find that the quantity demanded will be 16 units. Okay, moving on to supply. The quantity supplied is how much firms are willing and able to sell at a particular price during a particular period of time. Now, sellers are not like buyers. Sellers respond more to higher prices. So when prices go up, sellers want to provide you with more goods. So the law of supply states that there is a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. So when prices go up, it increases the quantity supplied. So like a demand schedule, a supply schedule is going to show us a bunch of different prices with a different quantity demanded. So before we looked at Helen's demand for lattes, and now we're going to look at Starbucks' supply of lattes. So remember, for Starbucks to produce a cup of coffee, they have quite a few inputs that they need to acquire. First, they need coffee, they need milk, they need infrastructure, they need workers, etc. So think of it this way. Would Starbucks ever be willing to offer lattes at $0? And according to our chart, the answer is of course no, because there's always a positive cost to the production of lattes. So you'll notice that the price of lattes is increasing on this chart. And at the same time, you'll see that the quantity supplied, or the number of units Starbucks is willing to supply, is also increasing. Therefore, we end up with this positively sloped supply curve. Okay. Now, where do we get market supply? Well, the market supply comes from the summation of all the quantity supplied at a variety of prices for different sellers. So, for example, at $2, Starbucks is willing to sell 6 lattes. Jitters is willing to sell 4, and so at $2 the market supply of lattes is 10 units. Now, why may Starbucks and Jitters vary in their number of units they're willing to supply? Well, that could be tied with their costs of production. So, similar to the demand curve, we can distinguish between a change in supply versus a change in quantity supplied. So changes in prices equal to changes in quantity supplied, and its movement along the given supply curve. In order to shift the supply curve, so in order, if we had this supply curve here, S, in order to shift this supply curve or increase it or shift it to the right, you would need to change one of the determinants of supply that is not the actual price that's on the y-axis. So the 4 shifters of supply are the price of inputs, technology, number of sellers, and expectations of future prices. Price of inputs. Examples of input prices. So inputs are factors of production. So whenever the price of the factors of production goes up, that's an increase in the price of inputs. This includes wages, prices of raw materials, the capital, the building that these firms function in, the equipment necessary to produce the final output. Any change in the price of these will result in a shifting of the supply curve. So for example, if we increased wages by 10%, you'd have an actual shifting inward or a reduction in supply. And a fall in input prices, a reduction in the price of inputs, will make it more profitable at each price to produce goods, and therefore you'll have more output produced. So if you get a reduction in the price of milk, we're sticking with our Starbucks example, that means at each price the quantity of lattes supplied will increase. In this case, it increased by 5 units. The second shifter is technology. Technology determines how much inputs are required to produce a unit of output. A cost-saving technological improvement has the same effect as a fall in input prices, and this would shift the supply curve to the right. So in terms of technology, we're really basically saying an improvement in efficiency or production per worker, production per hour, etc. More efficiency means lower cost of production, means a positive shift in supply, and producers are willing to supply more at every price. The next shifter is the number of sellers. So an increase in the number of sellers increases the quantity of supplied at each price. So this shifts the supply curve to the right. This is the most straightforward. More sellers, you shift the supply curve to the right and you get more output. Expectations. Let's look at an example. Sellers respond to expectations of the future prices just like buyers, except they respond to changes in future expected input prices and the expected price of the good itself. So for example, events in the Middle East lead to expectations of higher oil prices. In response, owners of Texas oil fields reduce supply now, save the inventory, and sell it later at the higher price. Later we'll discuss how that temporary action of saving current inventory not only affects the future price, but actually causes the price to shift in the current time period. So in general, sellers may adjust supply when their expectations of future prices change. Now, the time they cannot adjust their future supply is if the good is perishable. If it's not perishable, then you can adjust. Supply curve and algebra. So the equation for the supply curve in this case we'll assume is P equals 0.25 Q. So the 0.25 Q is telling us the upward sloping of this line. Let's answer this following question. What is the quantity supplied if the price is $4? So what we're going to do is we're going to input 4 into this value for P and basically solve for the price, quantity supplied. And here we find the quantity supplied is 16 when the price is $4. What is the quantity supplied if the price is $2? Well, if the price is $2, once again, we plug that into the price in the equation, and we find that the quantity supplied is 8 units. So notice, as the price decreases, the quantity supplied that the seller is willing to sell also decreases. Let's put supply and demand together. Equilibrium. When supply and demand are equal and intersect. So the price in the market is given to us when quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. So here we'll see a little graphic, and this is relevant to our Starbucks example as we'll see in a second. When the price is $3, the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied, meaning that as the number of units demanded by consumers is equal to the number of units provided for sale by the producers, which means there's no shortage or surplus in this market. So if we look at this table, the point where the price is the market price is when price is $3 in this case, and the quantity demanded and quantity supplied is equal. In cases where there's a shortage or an excess demand for goods is when the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. In these cases, the price will in fact rise in order to adjust away from the shortage if there is no government mandate on keeping it low. In the cases of a surplus or excess supply, the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded, leading to excess supply. Now, the way that the market adjusts a surplus is by pushing the price down. The next video will show you guys a whole process of market equilibrium. Market equilibrium. So let's start by drawing our downward sloping demand curve and our upward sloping supply curve. So the market equilibrium in this case is this point here at the intersection of supply and demand. This generates our equilibrium level of output and consumption, Q, and our equilibrium price that prevails in the marketplace. So why is that the equilibrium price? Well, let's see what happens if the price is below equilibrium. Let's call it P1. So at P1, we have a disequilibrium between quantity demanded and quantity supplied. So at P1, the number of units available for sale by suppliers is QS1 based on the supply curve, and the number of units demanded at that price by consumers is QD1. Now notice here what we have. We have misalignment of quantity supplied and quantity demanded. In this case, quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied, and therefore we have a shortage of the good, which means there isn't enough for everybody that wants to buy it. So how do you mitigate a shortage in the market? Well, you allow the market price to rise. So the market price begins to increase, and as the market price increases, notice what's happening is the shortage is shrinking and shrinking until it approaches the equilibrium point. Right. Let's look at a situation where price is above equilibrium, P2. So at P2, what we have is another misalignment of quantity supplied and quantity demanded. At P2, the number of buyers that would like to purchase the good are QD2, we'll call it. And the number of sellers that are willing to produce that good at that price and sell it is QS2. Notice in this case, since the price is higher, more sellers are willing to sell that product. And so what we end up with is an actual excess supply or a surplus in the marketplace. And now how do you correct a surplus? Well, to induce people to buy more goods, right, to increase the quantity demanded consumed, you start to reduce the market price. And as the market price starts to fall, the gap between quantity supplied and quantity demanded starts to shrink until, of course, the price approaches the equilibrium. So once the price is at equilibrium, without any other market modifications, the price can stay at equilibrium. Now, once there is anything that shifts the demand curve and or supply curve, the market will have to readjust back to a new equilibrium. 3 steps to analyzing changes in equilibrium. Well, it's finally time for us to figure out where prices come from. So, the 3 steps to determining our price and the number of units consumed. Step 1. Decide whether the event shifts supply curve, demand curve, or both. Second, decide in which direction the curve will shift. And third, use the diagram to see how the shift changes the equilibrium. Example 1. The market for electric cars. The event we're going to be analyzing is an increase in the price of gas. How is the price of gas relevant for electric cars? Well, first of all, the substitute for an electric car is a regular gasoline-powered car. So when the price of gasoline increases, that will have a dampening effect on the demand for regular cars. And since electric cars do not need gasoline, you will see an increase in the demand for electric cars. Let's have a look at the next video to give us a whole process. Okay, let's start with the equilibrium of supply and demand. So we have our downward sloping demand curve and our upward sloping supply curve. Let's start off with our initial equilibrium with Q star and P star, the market price and quantity. And let's call this equilibrium 1. So what's happening in this case? So the scenario we're looking at is, first of all, for the market for electric cars. And the scenario that's occurred is that the price of gasoline has increased. Now, how does that affect the market for electric cars? Well, the way we think about it is that regular cars that run on gasoline are substitutes to electric cars. So when the price of gasoline goes up, we may substitute away from regular gas-consuming cars into electric cars. So what happens in that case is we see an increase in the demand for electric cars. So demand curve goes from D1 to D2. We have a positive rightward shift of the demand curve. Now, what's happening in terms of the price and quantity? Well, at that original price at P1, what we have in this market is basically a shortage where quantity supplied is actually less than quantity demanded. And recall that to fix a shortage, what has to happen is that the price has to increase. So the price will keep increasing until quantity supplied and quantity demanded are back in equilibrium and settle on a new value. So as a result of the increased demand for electric vehicles, there is now available more electric vehicles in the market, and at the same time, we end up with a higher market price. So at the end of our demand and supply analysis, what we find is that prices have increased and the number of goods available for consumption have also increased. So the increase in the price of gasoline led to an increase in the price of electric cars. Example 2. New technology reduces the cost of producing batteries for electric cars. So when the cost of production for electric cars reduces, that means that the supply of electric cars will increase because we had a reduction in input costs. Next video will show us all the steps to the process. Once again, we start off by drawing our downward sloping demand curve and upward sloping supply curve. Now, to analyze what is happening in this market, again, we start off with identifying our initial equilibrium, Q1 star and P1 star. We'll call this, once again, equilibrium 1. So what happened in this scenario? It says technological improvements lead to reduced price for electric car batteries. So what is the electric car battery? Well, it's an input into the production of electric cars. So when that price falls, right, it is now cheaper to produce electric cars per unit, and therefore you get an increase in the supply of electric cars. Now, there's basically a rightward shift of the supply curve, and therefore an increase in the supply. Now, what is happening in terms of the market price and quantity? So initially, at the given market price at P1, what you'll notice is the quantity demanded here of the demand curve is less than the quantity supplied. So we have an excess supply. And therefore, what's going to happen is the price will be pushed down until it reaches the new equilibrium level. Now, what has happened in the market? Well, we can see that the quantity supplied and quantity demanded of electric vehicles has increased from Q1 to Q2. And in this case, the price has fallen from P1 star to P2 star. So what happens as a result of technological improvements in the market for electric cars? Well, the price falls and the quantity consumed / produced increases. So technological improvements lead to a reduction in the price of goods and services. Example 3. Increase in the price of gas and new technology reduces cost of producing batteries for electric cars. So in this case, we have an increase in demand and supply. Let's have a look in the next video to see what happens. What if both events occurred simultaneously? So we had both an increase in the price of gas and an improvement in the technology of battery production. So once again, we start with our downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve, and we have Q1 star, our initial equilibrium quantity, and P1 star, our initial equilibrium price. So once again, here we are at E1. Now, what do we know so far? We know that an increase in the price of gas leads to an increase in the demand for electric vehicles, ECs. Now, what else happens is there's an improvement in technology. We know what that does is it increases the supply of electric vehicles. So what has occurred here? We've had both an increase in supply and an increase in demand. Well, let's see what's happening. We have a new equilibrium. We'll call it E2. Now at E2, the way I've drawn this demand and supply curve, what it looks like is that the price is actually staying the same, although we can tell very clearly and unambiguously that the number of units sold and purchased have in fact increased. This result is purely because the way I drew the shifts in the supply and demand curves. So in this case, I drew that the shift in demand, or the change in demand, was equal to the change in supply. That made it look like the price stayed effectively constant and didn't change, whereas Q1 is definitely less than Q2. But what if we can then identify that there was the shift in demand was greater than the shift in supply, or the shift in supply was greater than the shift in demand? Well, let's see what happens in that case. What if the change in demand is greater than the change in supply? So let's see what happens when the shift in demand is greater than the shift in supply. So we'll do an exaggerated shift in the demand curve, and we'll change the supply just a little bit. So what happened here? So here's D2 and S2. Well, what do we have in this case? We have our new equilibrium E2, except in this case we notice that Q2 star again definitely is increasing, right? But what happens to the price? Price has gone up. So when we get a change in demand, an upward change in demand that is greater than the upward change in supply, we end up with an increased price and an increased quantity. What if the change in supply is greater than the change in demand? So once again, let's draw our increased demand as a result of the increase in the price of gasoline. And let's add on the increase in supply in electric vehicles. So now what do we notice? Well, we have E2. What happened at E2? Once again, unambiguously, we could see there was a large increase in the quantity. But at the same time, since the change in supply was bigger than the change in demand, what it did is it actually put downward pressure on the price. So what we ended up here as a result was a reduction in the price of electric vehicles and an increase in the number of units. So remember, technological improvements put downward pressure on the price, okay? And increase in demand for a good put upward pressure on the price. In terms of quantity, the improved technology puts upward pressure on the number of units bought and sold, and increased demand also puts upward pressure on the number of units bought or sold. So you notice that the issue is that the variation in terms of the size of the shift creates an indetermination of the changes in the price, but we can clearly see that both curves shifting in the same direction cause an increase in the number of units available for sale. So when demand and supply shift simultaneously, when demand and supply both increase, there is upward pressure on the quantity. The price is undetermined as it depends on whether the shift in demand was greater than the shift in supply. When demand and supply both, you have clear downward pressure on the quantity in the marketplace, but the pressure on price is undetermined as again it depends on which of the two shifted more. If demand and supply shift in opposite directions, when demand goes up, supply goes down, here there's a clear upward pressure on the price, but quantity can't be determined unless we know the magnitude of the shift. When demand falls and supply goes up, there's clear downward pressure on the price, but again, quantity cannot be determined unless we know the magnitude of the shift. Let's do some algebra with our demand and supply. So this problem states that the quantity demanded equation for this good is 90 minus 2p, And the quantity supplied equation, or the equation of the supply curve, is equal to P. It wants us to find the equilibrium price and quantity for this good. So first, let's draw this graphically and then we'll solve it with algebra. So we have our quantity and our price, they're little arrows. We have our demand curve, and in this case, the equation for the demand curve is 90 minus 2p, and the supply curve, the equation is equal to p. Recall that the equation of a line is y equals mx plus b. In this case, the b will represent our y-intercept. The m is equal to the slope. Okay, so this is just our simple linear equation, or the equation for a line. And in this case, the equation for the supply curve is equal to P, and the equation for the demand curve is 90 minus 2P. Right, you can see it's negative, rise over run. And in this case, we didn't graph it correctly, but this line for the demand curve would be steeper than the line for the supply curve. Okay, so what we're trying to find with algebra is what is this Q star and P star. In order to do that, we're going to set quantity supply equals to quantity demanded, right, in order to get that equilibrium level. Okay, so how do we do this? So let's set 90 minus 2p equal to p. So 90 equals 3p, price is equal to $30. Now, just to simply use the quantity supplied equation here, right, to substitute, QS is equal to P, therefore QS is equal to 30. So our equilibrium values are quantity is 30 and price is $30 at equilibrium. Okay, so similar to the example we did before when we looked at demand curve and supply curve separately, here let's use that same equation and solve for equilibrium. Remember to set the prices equal to each other. So to find equilibrium, set the prices equal to each other and solve for quantity. You can actually solve for either one. It doesn't really make a difference. In this case, we find that the equilibrium price is 12. We plug 12 into one of our equations, the supply curve or the demand curve, into the quantity, and we find that the price is $3 in equilibrium. Okay. This video illustrates to us demand and supply with algebra. Next video will show this process, exactly how the process. So remember, the really important distinction we have to make is in the shift in demand versus the shift in quantity demanded. To do that, we're going to illustrate it with this example. Question: suppose that a local pizza place likes to run a late night special. The owners have contacted you for some advice. One of the owners tells you, we want to increase the demand for pizza, and proposes 2 marketing ideas to accomplish this goal. The first is to reduce the price of the large pizzas, and the second is to reduce the price of a complement good. For example, offer 2 half-price bottles or cans of soda with every large pizza ordered. The video will illustrate this quantitatively.